Hey everyone, welcome back to Christ is the Cure. We are continuing Zoroastrianism, and now we're getting into the nitty-gritty with the history of Zoroastrianism. Before we begin, I just want to warn you that you may hear some birds whistling in the background. I have that tree right outside my window, and the birds are just getting in the springtime mood, I guess. So let's just get into it. So Zoroastrianism, we talked about the principles and the main focus in the last episode. And now we're going to introduce it a little bit more and talk about its history. So Zoroastrianism is a small religion of roughly 110 to 200,000 followers that is generally recognized as originating in ancient Persia. The following of Zoroastrianism is primarily found in India and Iran, with the movement slowly growing in the United States, albeit in a westernized, usually synchronized form. And I talked about that in the last episode at the end. Now, Zoroastrianism is also sometimes called Mazdaism, and its focus is on the deity Ahura Mazda, also called Ormazd. And I'm just going to throw it out there. If you're an old listener of Christ is the Cure, you know that pronunciation is kind of my downfall sometimes. And with this particular series, it's really difficult. And so if you're a new listener or you're an adherent of Zoroastrianism, I deeply apologize if I mispronounce things. I've been trying to be careful and make sure that I'm doing my best, but there's some words that are just tripping me up sometimes. So anyway, Zoroastrianism is considered one of the oldest religions in the world and a key figure, sometimes deemed the founder and at other times the reformer of the pre-Zoroastrian religion of Ahura Mazda is Zoroaster or Zarathustra, and we're going to be referring to him as Zoroaster in most cases. Now, as for Zoroaster, he is seen as the one who either, again, formed or reformed Mazda worship and orally composed the text called the Gathas, which is the oldest part or text of the Zoroastrian holy book, called the Avesta. We're going to be going more into the Avesta in the next episode, or the next episodes, because I don't know how long this one's going to be and how many parts it's going to be, but we're going to talk about that at a separate time. Now, Jenny Rose, who again wrote Zoroastrianism and Introduction, states that recently, however, the history of Zoroaster as the sole author of the Gathas has been questioned, but generally the Gathas are attributed to Zoroaster himself, while the other books of the Avesta that we're going to get into later, like I said, have different places in history. First, we're going to step back actually and talk about Zoroastrianism broadly. So we're going to talk about pre-Zoroastrianism. This is Ahura Mazda worship before Zoroaster. So while Zoroastrianism is considered one of the oldest ancient monotheistic religions, getting a handle on when it exactly dates to is difficult because of its connection with Zoroaster. Namely, the question surrounds, well, when did he live? And that point is debated. And where things get kind of confusing is that some will speak of all Mazda worship, whether before Zoroaster lived or after, as Zoroastrianism, regardless of when he lived. Obviously, this is kind of problematic because if Zoroaster's name is attached to Zoroastrianism, then what came before him couldn't really be Zoroastrianism. So you either have pre-Zoroastrianism or Mazda worship. And so others will note that it's more appropriate to differentiate early Mazda worship from these reforms of Zoroaster and what is actually called Zoroastrianism, which makes sense to me at least. James Barr will speak about 5 different areas of development in Zoroastrian religion. And this is James Barr's article, The Question of Religious Influence, the Case of Zoroastrianism, Judaism, and Christianity. And he will have these areas of development. First, the pre-Zoroastrian religion of Ahura Mazda. Second, the religion of reform via Zoroaster. Third, the religion of the Achaemenid Empire. And fourth, the post-Achaemenid Zoroastrianism. And then the religion of the Magi later on. So having those 5 points of development outlined helps at least kind of mentally picture what we're looking at here. Since Zoroastrianism is designated by the following of Zoroaster and his teachings and his writings, the Gathas, it is, again, best to conceptualize Zoroastrianism proper as existing only when Zoroaster comes onto the scene. This is especially so because the Gathas are, quote, the authoritative original teachings. For some, anything that is perceived as differing from the Gothic teachings is not considered to be authentically Zoroastrian, although may be recognized as part of a general continuum. And that is from Jenny Rose's An Introduction on Zoroastrianism. So at that point, the questions abound concerning what forms of Zoroastrianism existed when Zoroaster entered into history and reformed it. Now, it's widely acknowledged that significant develops occurred in those 5 periods that I mentioned before. The difficulty is pinning A, when did Zoroaster live, and B, when what was believed and in what form, given that the written materials of the holy book containing the Gathas wasn't actually put to paper until the 5th and 6th century AD. So while a lot of this talk is BC, the actual writings weren't on paper until, again, the 400s and 500s AD. Prior to this text of the Gathas being written down, they were orally transmitted, with the appropriate alphabet for its written composition only being invented in the 3rd century AD, that is the 200s. As Encyclopedia Iranica states, quote, owing to both the nature and availability of sources, it is difficult to write a comprehensive history of Zoroastrianism, as there are periods about which we know very little, others for which information is well restricted to circumscribed subjects or genres, and still others that must be reconstructed by reading back in time from the contents of later writings or by reading forward from the sources of cognate cultures. And again, that's from Encyclopedia Iranica Foundation on Zoroastrian's Historical Review of the Arab Conquest. So besides the Gathas, other literature that make up this holy book of the Avesta were written between the 6th to 10th century AD, making things even more complex. Again, we're going to get back to that later. And so that brings up the question of, well, what was specifically believed? But back to point A, when did Zoroaster live and reform Mazda worship? So we're going to do our best here, and we're going to first discuss the religion prior to Zoroaster, during the 3rd millennium BC, which is between 3000 and 2001 BC. Now, there were tribes calling themselves Araya who lived within Central Asia, and then in the 2nd millennium, 2 groups split off from this one group, and that would be the Indo-Arayans who moved into ancient Near East and the Iranians. These groups developed separately, but they're often studied together, okay? So both groups worshipped a plurality of deities, so polytheism, with some common between them. Like they both shared Mitra, who later on become Mithra. But anyway, the pantheon of these people had a head god, a supreme god, Ahura Mazda. And you can think of this in terms of like Zeus. He's the king of the deities in the Greek pantheon. This god had dominion over creation and kept order. And in this system, a demiurge, that is a being who is subordinate to Mazda, was the crafter of creation and the earth. And so you have that type of delegation. This demiurge's name was Ameshaspinta, who was one of Mazda's wives. And of course, the pantheon had other deities such as Rasnu, who was the judge of man's oaths, and then Mitra, who looked over treaties between nations and people. But we're going to move on anyway because it's not really relevant. In this religion, there were priests who presided over worship and sacrifices, and one of these priests would eventually be Zoroaster. He was a priest who would bring in reforms, allegedly from Mazda himself. Now, on the complexity of Zoroaster's life, Iranica states, quote, one of the most vexing problems for a history of Zoroastrianism is the location of Zoroaster in time and place. While there is a general agreement that he did not live in western Iran, attempts to locate him in specific regions of eastern Iran, including Central Asia, remain tentative. Also uncertain are his dates. Plausible arguments place him anywhere from the 13th century BCE to just before the rise of the Achaemenid Empire underneath Cyrus II the Great in the mid-6th century BCE, with the majority of scholars seeming to favor dates around 1000 BCE. Just a note that whenever I'm reading these, I'm replacing Zoroastrustra, that name, with Zoroaster, just so that you have consistency as a listener, and you don't have to think, well, who's that? Because it's the same guy, just a different name. Lovern, and her article that I quoted in the last episode, Zoroastrianism and Christianity Standing Close to One Another, summarizes some of the data on this topic as follows. Quote, simply determining when he, that is Zoroaster, lived is challenging. For example, 558 BCE was the date ascribed to Zoroaster during the Seleucid dynasty based on the calculations given by the Magi. However, Aristotle himself, dated in the 4th century BCE, claimed that Zoroaster lived 6,000 years earlier. It is possible that this extreme date was a way of downplaying the politics involved in studying and revering a rival Persian. Another date of 1000 BC was given using linguistic markers, which M.L. West cautions is linguistically unfounded. In his opinion, one cannot take the body of text in an otherwise undocumented language and declare on linguistic grounds that they must belong to the second and not to the first millennium BCE. The use of language could, it seems, be placed in the first and second millennium, but ascribing exact reference to one century over the other is problematic given regional language use. Finally, traditional Persian ideology dates Zoroaster around 660 BCE, and this date has become the generally accepted date by modern scholars, although no universal agreement exists. We're going to circle back to this dating of Zoroaster and its relevance in a minute, but what we can say is that according to oral tradition, and then later contained in the Gathas, is that Zoroaster received a vision from Ahura Mazda and then transformed the traditional beliefs by elevating Mazda closer to monotheism, with other figures mentioned already becoming part of the religion either as divine entities emanating from Mazda, kind of similar to Hinduism, or as angels, a point that's also debated in modern times, which we're going to get to as well. Hopefully you can see why this is hard to organize. There's a lot of different threads being pulled on here, but hopefully this all makes sense as we continue on. But like one of the debated issues is on Amisha Spinta. Originally, like I said earlier, this was the demiurge of creation who was also a wife of Mazda. But now it's, a question of, is it a being, an angel, or a spirit of Mazda? But the whole concept of Amisha Spinta doesn't occur in the Gathas at all, but in other parts of the Avesta. So that's just one example. Another key point in the Gathas is the idea of dualism, this principle of truth versus falsehood leading to division among the Huras and the Devas. These are different classes of deities or angels, depending on, again, the tradition. And how these are interpreted, even dualism, a designation that some try to avoid, is debated. But we're going to go back to those concepts whenever we get to doctrines. Let's continue with our history. So far we have this pre-Zoroastrian religion that's polytheistic. We don't really know where Zoroaster falls in terms of the timeline. And so we're just kind of moving past that for right now. Instead, we're going to talk about the Achaemenid period. The Persian period is really where the rubber meets the road in terms of influence between Zoroastrianism and Judaism, or even pre-Zoroastrianism and Judaism, right? Because that's kind of a question. And this is where the two groups would initially intersect. This is where they would have that interaction that would allow for potential influence of one another. So it's at this point, so we are generally told that the Jews picked up a good deal of ideas from Zoroastrianism and then took them home with them whenever they left Persia and went back to Jerusalem, even to the point, according to some, that texts like Genesis were actually rewritten to reflect those Zoroastrian ideas. So a key point of interest is the Achaemenid period, which is during rulers who claim to be descendants of Achaemenids. So around 900 BC, the Persians migrated into southwestern Iran, and Cyrus the Great conquered the Median capital in 550, perhaps where pre- or post-Zoroaster Zoroastrianism might have had a presence. Yet, quote, we possess too little information about this period to form any clear idea of what the religious practices and beliefs were. And that's from Encyclopedia Iranica Foundation, Zoroaster's Historical Review. Now, the historian Herodotus does mention the Magi during this period, who would eventually assume a priestly function in Zoroastrianism in the post-Achaemenid period, but information is still limited on what exactly was happening and what was believed. And so after taking the Median capital, Cyrus moved into Babylon, defeating the Babylonian army in 539. And during this time, Cyrus entered the capital and restored the city, ordering the restoration of ancient temples. He also permitted the return of the Jews from exile and facilitated the rebuilding of the temple in Jerusalem. Now, at this point, I'm going to kind of assume that you know your Old Testament. So you might need to look at Babylonian exile and the interaction with Cyrus the Great for supplement. If you don't, pull out your study Bible and look out the timelines if they offers it or outlines or whatever. But we're kind of assuming that because I not going to squeeze all that in here too. But Cyrus permitted the Jews to return to Jerusalem and rebuild, and it actually helped facilitate the rebuilding of the temple in Jerusalem. And so now we're going back to the question of Zoroaster's life. The question is, when did Zoroaster live and spread influence in the region? And did that influence Cyrus the Great? And did Cyrus the Great influence the Jews? Because the Bible does talk highly about Cyrus the Great. And so an earlier date of Zoroaster's life, as argued by Mary Boyce, would allow for Zoroaster's teachings to spread and convert Iranian leaders where, quote, by the time that Cyrus established the Persian Empire, he was thoroughly devoted Zoroastrian. In her paradigm, Zoroaster lived sometime between 1500 and 1200 BC, giving plenty of time for Zoroaster's Zoroastrianism to dominate the region and then influence Cyrus the Great and thus influence the Jews. However, with the later and traditional dating of Zoroaster's life between the 6th and 5th century BC, Cyrus being influenced by Zoroaster is unlikely, as he would be teaching just before Cyrus took power, not leaving much time for his teachings to actually spread and reach Cyrus to a significant degree. Corduan actually interacts with Boyce's argumentation for an earlier date and influence of monotheism, noting that the best conclusion seems to be the one based on sources that have already attempted to date Zoroaster, which again includes the Zoroastrian traditional understanding, and that is that they date him 258 years before the time of Alexander, and that is Alexander the Great. And he argues that specificity of 258 years before the time of Alexander is not inconsequential. Quote, the time of Alexander was so cataclysmic in Persian history that it remained a constant reference point, end quote, in historical works and things of that nature, right? And so he'll further state, quote, this gives us a date of 588 BC, only 2 years before the Jewish Babylonian captivity and 30 years before Cyrus's rise. And a matter that is not clear is to what even in Zoroaster's life this date could correspond. 3 options are his birth, his call, and his conversion of King Vishtaspa. So in other words, we're given this date of when he lived by traditional sources, but we don't know if this date refers to, well, he was born this day, or he was called to reform this day, or he converted someone this day. And that is significant if we're talking timelines. So concerning this dating, Corduan argues that a reference to his birth is unlikely due to more potential evidence of King Darius having Zoroastrian sympathies in 521, which leaves the other 2 possibilities open, his call and his conversion. Corduan will also defend this later dating of Zoroaster, appealing to the Sasanian kings who are important in Zoroastrian history. The Sasanian rulers had a presence in Iran in AD 224 to 651, and they viewed themselves as successors of the Achaemenid Persians and had a significant role in Zoroastrianism by making it the state religion and facilitating work on the Avesta. We'll come back to them as well too. But they would work to standardize the text and commentate on the text via the Zand to establish its canon and so forth. These kings also established a chronology of the faith that presupposed the 6th century dating of Zoroaster, in which, quote, they saw their own era beginning, end quote. As it's been argued even by Zoroastrian adherents, chronological matters were of high value to the Magi and Zoroastrianism, and the traditional date of Zoroaster fits with other events, namely that there are no teachings unique to Zoroaster in the Persian king's writings until perhaps Darius. Even when Darius claims devotion to Mazda, however, he acknowledges, quote, other gods that are. By all accounts, Zoroaster's teachings are slow to be received. In fact, during 404 to 359 BC, we see more emergence of some Zoroastrian ideas related to the prophet himself, but not without still remaining a full pantheon of deities. And the religion's history during the conquest of Alexander is so fragmentary that we don't really know much about it. But for our purposes, we're just going to move on. And we're going to talk about Cyrus the Zoroastrian with the question mark. Now, the earlier dating of Zoroaster would certainly allow for a Cyrus who is devoted to Zoroastrian teachings. In fact, it is actually often assumed and spread that the Persians had Zoroastrianism as their official religion. The issue is that there's no evidence that Cyrus was Zoroastrian, especially in the sense of the reforms of Zoroaster. There is no consensus on whether the kings of Persia during this time were influenced by Zoroaster, even when mentioning Ahura Mazda. None of the Persian kings during this time, nor Herodotus, who mentioned Magi, mentioned Zoroaster, nor are there clear quotes from the Gathas, meaning quotes that cannot be understood differently. And this is also cited from the Encyclopedia Iranica Foundations on Zoroastrianism, a historical review. Cyrus himself rebuilt the temple of Marduk, the deity of Babylon, and he rebuilt this temple in Babylon and claimed that he worshipped Marduk. Some argue that this was a political move and that he was really Zoroastrianism, but this ultimately begs the question. Quote, although Cyrus's famous cylinder inscription proclaimed himself as an appointee of the Babylonian deities, may be dismissed as pure propaganda, it does stand in sharp contrast to the fervent devotion to Ahura Mazda, and that's also from Encyclopedia Iranica. In other words, while people want to assert that he was this fervent devotee to Mazda, he claimed to be a worshiper of Marduk, a Babylonian deity. Now, moving on a little bit, some try to argue that Isaiah makes the case that Cyrus was Zoroastrianism, but this is a pretty big stretch with no real logical connections as far as I can see. Now, the Bible does speak very highly of Cyrus, and it actually applies the term Messiah or anointed one to him as the one who liberated the people from exile. He was the anointed one who saved Israel in that sense. He let them leave, and then he helped them return and rebuild the temple. However, reading beyond this to suggest that it tells us either the religion of Cyrus or that his religion bled into Judaism is just a stretch. Contrary to the rhetoric, this does nothing to move forward the assertions being made. Further, there is no text that addresses the religious beliefs of the Zoroastrians or Persians, and the Bible consistently just calls out idolatry. We talked about that principle of resistance in episode 1. That's significant here. Now, some claim that later texts in Isaiah resemble the Gathas. We'll get to that in a minute. But not only would Isaiah predate what we have actually written of the Gathas, again, penned in the 6th century AD, and no manuscript until the 13th century AD, but the phrases, even if appropriated by Jews and applied to Yahweh, could be seen as polemics against Zoroastrianism in the same way that Paul takes Roman mantras such as peace and security in 1 Thessalonians 5:3 to counter the Roman ideology of peace and security. To the first point about Isaiah predating the written text of the Gathas, one must ask why Zoroaster must be the influencer and not vice versa, especially when modern interpretations of what exactly Zoroastrianism even looked like in this period have no consensus, let alone a consensus of what the Avesta teaches in general on some of these allegedly borrowed doctrines in our modern era. As Iranica stated, we just don't know what was believed at this time. So let's talk a little bit about the biblical books being written during this Persian period, such as Daniel and Esther. Now, what can be said about these books is that the authors, quote, all betray the time of their composition during and after the Persian era by the presence of Persian loanwords, by reference to Iranian or Zoroastrian entities, and by reference to Persian political practices. And that is from Charles David Isbell, Zoroastrianism and Biblical Religion. And so to this quote, we want to say first that the alleged Zoroastrian entities found in these biblical texts consist of Cyrus, and that's assuming that he was a Zoroastrianism. So it's begging the question. It's not really helpful here. Now, it is true that there is a reference to Zoroastrianism in the apocryphal book of Tobit. It mentions Osmotus, but he includes this in his biblical texts, right? Which the apocrypha have a later dating anyway. So what about Daniel? Well, Daniel was known for not compromising and simultaneously working with Darius, the closest we have to a confirmed Zoroastrian during this period, in whatever form you want to take that as. Many know the narrative of Daniel, right? And the lines in especially, where Daniel nearly dies for praying to and worshiping Yahweh instead of Darius, which interestingly presents a conflict with Zoroastrianism's monotheistic proposal. Darius is calling for the prayer and worship directed to him. Daniel says, no, I'm going to worship Yahweh. There's no Mazda worship being included here, and Daniel isn't wavering. The plot to kill Daniel was his jealous rivals. And this aside, Daniel was influential in Babylon, both under Babylonian and Persian rule. Under Darius, Daniel was one of the 3 high officials, quote, distinguished above all the other high officials and governors, and the king planned to set him over the whole kingdom, and that's according to 6:1-3. This raises the question of why Daniel couldn't have been the influence on the Zoroastrianisms if he was in contact with them. It's just, why can't it go the other way is the question. He obviously held high influence and was committed to the point of death to Yahweh. Compromise from Zoroastrianism pressure seems pretty unlikely given what we know. Now, moving on through that quote above, we should mention loanwords. But what is a loanword? A loanword is or are words that we use in one language that originated in another without modification. We have many of these in English, such as cafe, ranch, anger, law, etc. Loanwords appear in most languages worldwide and can be found in both the Hebrew Bible and the New Testament. Maranatha, for example, in 1 Corinthians 16:22, which was written in Greek, it's a loanword from the Aramaic. So it's an Aramaic word written in Greek. There was also more obvious ones that we know. Sabbath is a Hebrew word written in Greek. Hosanna, rabbi, and then, of course, proper names are included in this. Another example, in the Hebrew Bible, there are loanwords from Egypt. For example, in Genesis 38, there are personal names, place names, and so on that are used in the biblical text. Loanwords do show linguistic influence, but do not necessitate doctrinal influence. And the Persian loanwords in the Bible are not really a problem. They're things such as the palace, the royal, treasury, royal garden. Some try to argue that the royal garden harkens back to the Garden of Eden, which goes into that question of, well, was Genesis allegedly rewritten or not? But even then, this idea of a sacred space as a garden was very common. And so then you go back to that principle of, well, this is universal. Corduan states, quote, that the three books of the Old Testament, which could chronologically establish a link to the Zoroastrianism of the Achaemenid period, Ezra, Nehemiah, and Esther, simply do not do so. The teachings associated with the supposed influence, that is, angels, resurrection, apocalypse, etc., make no appearance in these books. In fact, Ezra and Nehemiah specialize in the cultivation of purity in Judaism, and Esther is not occupied with doctrinal matters. So while Persian loanwords are present, there are no concerns over Zoroastrian religion or even addresses to it. Now, what should be pointed out here is that many will claim that the first 5 books of Moses were thus rewritten under this Persian and Zoroastrian influences, introducing monotheism and rewriting Genesis 1. I've mentioned this a couple times, but it's in my notes, so I just reread it. To this point, I believe it's Corduan. Charles David Isbell will say that, quote, not a single Persian loanword is known throughout the entirety of the Hebrew Torah, and one searches in vain for any hint of the existence of a Persian empire. On any fair reading, this should require an interpreter to ask how the great Persian Empire could fail to influence the most fundamental text of Judaism. If the Torah were composed during the Persian era, underneath the influence of Persian culture and religion, or even if the redactors of the Torah simply knew and were conversant with the Persian language, how could such a lacuna occur? Could a modern author compose a story purportedly set in a time of World War I and never, not even one time, make a reference to any event later than 1919? Could the same modern author go back even further in time and write about the Middle Ages without one slip of his pen, one tiny word that came into English only within the past 500 years or so? This seems to me as unlikely as the idea of a post-exilic biblical author retrojecting his storyline back over 1,000 years to the Torah narratives without once betraying himself via anything Persian vocabulary, historical reference, or synaptic structure. In fact, whenever we talk about the Old Testament, there's many discussions about it including words that existed at a later time than the events actually occurred, because someone wrote it down later from oral tradition, but was using that word to explain it for modern readers. And this is usually with location names. And so if we recognize those already in the Old Testament, but there's not a single one in reference to Persian or Zoroastrian culture, then that's a really hard argument to make. And so this is to say that while the books that were written during the Persian period have some loan words that we would expect, they don't really make reference to the things that matter on this topic. And then those that people are trying to say were rewritten during this period to reflect doctrinal influence such as monotheism, those don't have any hint of that. And so this leaves a great burden of proof for the Zoroastrian who wants to argue these points. Now let's talk about Isaiah. And I think this is our last section for this episode. Now we have 2 sections left for this episode, and then we're going to close it for today. So Isaiah, much is made of 2nd Isaiah. If you don't know, there's usually a distinction between 1st Isaiah and 2nd Isaiah in scholarship. Isaiah 2nd would be Isaiah 40 through 55, which is said to be produced at a different time than Isaiah 1 through 39. But that's a whole different thing that we're not really going to bother into. The whole point is that the claims is that 2nd Isaiah allegedly shows clear Zoroastrian influence. Yet, besides the proper name Cyrus, Isaiah doesn't even have Persian loanwords. Even in allowing for the 2nd Isaiah proposal, which I don't, problems remain for this notion. It is argued that Isaiah uses creation language that borrows from the Gathas, but the texts are too general. They're about creation from a single god. And if Zoroastrianism believes that Mazda is the creator of all things by the time the Gathas are penned, the same as Judaism, but with Yahweh, then what else would we expect? It's not very helpful. It doesn't really show influence either. It's just begging the question. It's like, well, this one talks about one creator. Okay, but you still haven't made the case that that's where we got it from. Other literature in the Old Testament already poses Yahweh as the creator in many texts that predate this period, which then goes back to there's no evidence that the other parts of the Hebrew Bible were rewritten with this influence. Still, the rhetoric is pushed further. Some say that Isaiah actually copies the Gathas and how it poses rhetorical questions. For example, the Gathas at one point say, quote, "Who created and ordered justice, the sun and stars, earth and sky, waters and plants, right thought, light and darkness," end quote. In the context of the Gathas, the answer is obviously Mazda. When appropriated by Isaiah, as they say, it's Yahweh. But there's still a problem here. First, why is it assumed that the Isaiah texts borrow from Zoroaster? Why could they not be independent? Or why couldn't the influence be the other way around, especially when Isaiah is penned earlier than the Gathas? Why would Isaiah borrow from Zoroaster in this way? Makes little sense when we have internal textual influence readily available already in the book of Job and Yahweh's rhetorical questions posed to Job. 2 examples of a long discourse that are very close to this is Job 11, 7 through 9, 38, 4 through 11, and 38 through 41 as a whole. Job was known before Cyrus' leadership. And Job was known as seen in Ezekiel's ministry in Jerusalem and Babylon in the first 3 decades of the 6th century. See Ezekiel 14 through 20. While the date of Job's composition is unknown, scholars generally understand the narrative it tells to be older than its physical composition. Most are happy to leave the date open-ended, yet others have proposed a range from the 8th century to the 4th century BC. Now, if the narrative of Job was known, even if not composed yet or put on paper, by individuals like Ezekiel and his audience, whom he appeals to with Job's name, there's no reason to think that Isaiah couldn't just pull from that rhetoric, mirroring Job. There's no reason to think that Isaiah would pull from Zoroastrian texts whenever he has Hebrew texts that sound like that already. Additionally, if the argument moves into, but that text could have been written as late as the 4th century BC, then the Zoroastrian position still remains with little legs to stand on if you're going to go with the transmission argument because of the Gatha's late transmission. Our oldest manuscripts of the Avesta being from the 13th century AD, which is a copy of a 9th, 10th century manuscript that we don't have. Meanwhile, Isaiah and Job both have manuscripts dating earlier, including their Greek translations. It does Zoroastrianism no favor to appeal to, well, what about textual transmission in this case? Because even our manuscripts are older. So it seems more likely that Isaiah was pulling from a tradition he already knew and rejecting the idea that the Hebrew Bible was entirely rewritten with Zoroastrian influence. What meaningful influence could he have gathered from Zoroastrianism, given what we already have in like Genesis, right? Or Job. Now, let's say that hypothetically Isaiah did utilize the Gathas, but then flipped them to praise Yahweh. Some will say that in this framework, that Isaiah uses the verses in the Gathas in a way of praise, or as if the Gathas were a positive influence on him. But given that Isaiah makes the answer to the rhetorical questions Yahweh and not Mazda, it's really quite contrary. It begs the question, why couldn't this be an outright rejection of Zoroastrian influence with polemics? Especially since this is, overall in context, a polemic against idolatry. It could be quite opposite of, we like Zoroastrianism, we are influenced by it, to, no, it's Yahweh who's the answer to these questions. It could be really strong to just flip their own text on them if they are being utilized at all. And this doesn't even really mention that there are passages in Isaiah where Isaiah makes claims that Zoroastrianism would admit that Mazda would never make such claims, namely Isaiah 45:7. And so it's going against the grain. There's no evidence of influence. And then even if there was usage of their text, it's not used in a favorable light, nor does it really give us evidence that Zoroastrianism theologically influenced Judaism. And we'll get into the specifics of doctrines and comparing and contrasting them later, like I said. So we're not going to end it here, but that's kind of that bit on these texts within the Persian period. Now let's go back to Cyrus for a second. So in reality, the dating of Zoroaster and the Persians is inconsequential when we look at the doctrines Jews allegedly borrowed from the Zoroastrians. For example, even if such concepts couldn't be found in scripture, such as monotheism, the Jews encountered other monotheists before encountering the Persians, making the whole argument irrelevant, as it's based on the idea that Zoroaster was revolutionary in his monotheism, and that Zoroastrianism was the first ancient monotheistic religion influencing the rest. And we're going to go into that later, but I don't really understand why Zoroastrianism gets that title, even if it were true that they were the first monotheistic religion, because there were others before the Persians who were monotheistic at a time. Still, a bird's eye view of the Avesta will be enlightening before we look at those doctrines supposedly taken from Zoroaster. And it will matter because, like a few of our writers have mentioned in passing, that what we have is a reading back of doctrines into this earlier period that were written much later. And so we'll get all into the Avesta in the next episode. And then I imagine the doctrines episode will be after that, along with the conclusion. I'm not really sure how long each of these are going to take. But so far, we're doing pretty good in terms of keeping this a condensed series. So that's it for today. God bless you all, and I hope you have a wonderful, wonderful weekend.